Number 1.
Colleen Simpson was just 14 years old when she disappeared in the night from her home in October of 1975. Her incident type is classified with the state of Iowa's endangered physical, meaning a person who is missing under circumstances indicating that his or her physical safety is in danger. Unfortunately, there are very few details available regarding Colleen and her disappearance. She had black hair, hazel eyes, and a moon-shaped scar on her right forearm. It is believed that she was last seen in her Clearfield, Iowa home Saturday evening, October 4, 1975. Clearfield is a small town in very rural southern Iowa. In 1975, an estimated 430 people lived there. Therefore, when she was reported missing the next day, it was to the Taylor County Sheriff's Office in neighboring Bedford, where her father was a patrol officer. There is almost no media coverage for Colleen's case at the time of her disappearance. One brief article from the Creston News Advertiser was published on October 30, 1975. Contradictory to Colleen's endangered physical designation, this article states that it is believed she ran away, and no foul play is suspected. Additionally, it lists her as reported missing the following day, October 6. It does not include her description. By August of 1994, however, the Cedar Rapids Gazette lists Colleen as one of just 3 Iowans missing and believed abducted by a stranger. The others are Des Moines Register newspaper delivery boys Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin. Colleen's case did not appear in the news again until 2006. The short article, link below, describes her father learning that one of the 50 photos of women belonging to serial killer William Bradford in California is not Colleen. He is now a former police chief. It's not her, he says, we are still waiting. Sadly, Jerry Simpson died waiting for news of his daughter in 2010. Comments to Colleen's Iowa cold case page provide possible clues to what may have happened, but just like mainstream media, posts from family and friends disagree about when and how Colleen went missing. A friend claims that she never returned from a family function, possibly in Grant, Iowa, approximately 50 miles away. Family maintains she must have left her Clearfield house in the middle of the night. Statements from family members on Facebook tell a story of a young and pregnant Colleen at odds with her parents that night. Sent to her room following an argument, she never emerged the next day. Despite years of searching, her family never saw her again. What happened to Colleen Simpson? This is my first write-up. I don't know why, but I just can't get Colleen out of my head. I grew up in this area, but didn't hear of her until recently. I know what it's like to grow up in a small town. While it is sometimes a welcoming community experience, it can also feel very isolating. It is also incredibly difficult to get away with anything, and secrets don't seem to last long. The lack of details and inconsistencies are frustrating. This girl seems to have a loving family that misses her. Even if she was a pregnant runaway, how would a 14-year-old escape a town of just 400 people without a trace? Finally, Colleen is listed as being 5'7" tall and only 90 pounds, making her severely underweight. A BMI of 14.1 puts her in the first percentile for her age. While only a headshot is included in her case file, the girl in the image appears to be healthy and not at all underweight. Could it be that Colleen was not 67 inches tall, 5 foot 7 inches, but 57 inches tall, 4 foot 9 inches? A BMI of 19.5 would put her at 45th percentile for her age. The simple addition of an apostrophe along the way could account for this. Colleen's case remains unsolved. Her parents have both since died. Her case is classified as a non-family abduction. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Taylor County Sheriff's Office 712-523-2153.
Number 2.
Robert Joseph Fritz was last seen in Campbellsport, Wisconsin on May 14, 1983. He was last seen playing in an empty lot near his family's home. He was with his sister and friends at the time. His sister told authorities that at some point between 2:30 p.m. and 4:30 p.m., Robert said he was hungry and started to set off for his house. Robert never made it to his home and has never been seen or heard from since. Robert's family and friends immediately started to search for him. Robert was last known to be playing with a toy gun which he was carrying. The toy was later recovered. Authorities immediately started to search for the boy. They initially believed it was possible that Robert possibly drowned in the Milwaukee River or the Mill Pond. Searches have been done, but Robert's remains were not found. Both of Robert's parents were divorced at the time of his disappearance. He had 6 siblings at the time of his disappearance. He lived with his mother and 4 of his siblings on East Main Street on Highway 67 at the time. His father and 2 of his brothers lived in Illinois at the time. His father was looked at as a possible suspect in his son's disappearance. He remarried a week after Robert's disappearance. They found no evidence to suggest that Robert's father was involved in any way. His parents were both eventually cleared of any possible involvement in his case. After no trace of Robert was found, authorities then concluded that Robert was abducted. The prime suspect in Robert's case is Michael Scott Menzer, a sex offender, who was identified as a suspect in the case a year after Robert's abduction. In 1980, Menzer was convicted of sexually abusing a 10-year-old boy, and after Robert vanished, authorities excavated Menzer's property. He lived at the Waldo Mill, a historic building that was located less than 20 miles away from where Robert was taken. They found boxes of child pornography. They also found news clippings about Robert's kidnapping and the remains of children's clothing and bones. The bones were subjected to advanced DNA testing in 2017 and were found to be those of an animal, which conclusively ruled that they weren't Robert's. The clothing was also tested, but no match was found. There is no evidence connecting Menzer to Robert's abduction. In 1991, Menzer burned down the Waldo Mill, killing his 2 stepsons while doing so. He had been previously charged with sexually assaulting the boys, but was later acquitted. He was convicted with the arson murders in 1992 and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He died in 2008 at the age of 59. He never cooperated in the investigation into Fritz's disappearance. Robert's case remains unsolved. His father has since passed away, and his mother moved out of the local area after his disappearance. He has never been found, and authorities suspect that he was kidnapped on the day of his disappearance. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Fond du Lac County Sheriff's Office 803-642-1761.
Number 3.
Marjorie Luna was last seen in Green Acres, Florida in the afternoon of May 27, 1984. She went to the Green Acres grocery to purchase cat food. She made the purchase at approximately 3 p.m. While many agencies state that Marjorie left the store after she made the purchase, it's possible that she stayed until 6 p.m. at the store to play video games, or that she walked to a local park afterwards. Marjorie was never seen again, and she never returned home afterwards. Marjorie was discovered missing at 8:30 p.m. by her sister, who told their mother of Marjorie's absence. Authorities immediately started to search for Marjorie after she was reported missing. They believe that Marjorie was the victim of foul play. After her disappearance, authorities located the turquoise bodysuit that she was wearing on that day in a swampy area near her home. For a time, authorities believed that Marjorie's neighbors, Willis and Charles Rambo, were possibly responsible for her disappearance. Marjorie was said to have visited their residence several times, and witnesses even saw Charles give Marjorie money one time. When one of Marjorie's closest friends was interviewed, she told authorities that the Rambo brothers had sexually abused her. They were charged with child molestation and plead guilty to lewd assault in the abuse case, and were both sentenced to 10 years probation. Later on, Willis was sentenced to 4 life terms in prison for the sexual abuse of his 2 stepdaughters. Charles was last known to be in Tennessee. Both men denied any involvement in Marjorie's disappearance, and their house was searched in connection to her case, but no evidence was found to implicate them in her disappearance. Authorities have stated that a top suspect in Marjorie's disappearance and presumed abduction is Victor George Vanita. He was golf course worker in 1984 with an extensive criminal history dating back to the 1960s, with sexual assaults and other offenses filling it. He is also considered the prime suspect in the 1984 New Hampshire abduction of Tammy Bellinger. Vanita is suspected to have been in the area at the time of Marjorie's disappearance. He attended a neighborhood party that took place in Marjorie neighborhood, and was also seen outside of the store that Marjorie visited that day. He maintained his innocence and stated he had never even met Marjorie. Victor was sentenced to 75 in prison for burglary and indecent exposure. At his trial, some prison inmates stated that Vanita confessed to killing both Marjorie and Tammy back in 1984. This has not been confirmed, and no charges were ever filed against him for the cases. There is no evidence that links him to their disappearances either. He was released from prison in 2012 and passed away nearly a year later. In 2010, authorities announced that they had a possible suspect in Marjorie's disappearance. The man was identified as Delbert Mosher. He lived in the area at the time of Marjorie's disappearance and would later be arrested for child molestation. He died in prison more than 20 years after Marjorie's disappearance. William Ferris has recently been considered a suspect in Marjorie's case. He was originally questioned regarding Marjorie's whereabouts and he denied knowing Marjorie. He later, however, admitted that he did in fact know Marjorie, as she would come to his yard to play with her friend when his wife babysat her. One day when both girls were playing together before her disappearance, he said that one of them would disappear. After she disappeared, Ferris said she would never be found. It's possible Marjorie may have tried to get to a friend's house on the day of her disappearance. If she did, she could cross Ferris's yard to reach it, but the friend wasn't there that day. It's still possible she tried to get there not knowing that. In 2019, authorities searched the property that Ferris lived on for any trace of Marjorie. A tip came into authorities due to the immense publicity that Marjorie's case has received. No evidence was found. The investigation into Marjorie's disappearance remains open, with her case being unsolved. Marjorie's mother is still alive and moved away after she disappeared, but has since moved back into the same house she shared with Marjorie's and her sister. Foul play is suspected in her case. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office 561-688-4013.
Number 4.
Jason Townsend was last seen in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on May 20, 1980. Jason, along with his siblings, were in the care of their mother, Augusta Townsend Walker's boyfriend, Roscoe Pierce, as she had to work the whole day. When Augusta returned home from work that night, Jason was not at the residence. Pierce stated that Jason had wandered away while they were at a convenience store near their home. Walker called authorities afterwards to report Jason as missing. Some reports indicate that Pierce was seen with Jason in Lauderhill later in the day. Pierce started to act suspicious within a day of Jason's disappearance, and Walker caught on to this. She noted that Pierce removed a sheet of blue plastic and 2 duffel bags from the apartment. When she attempted to stop him from leaving, he still went. Her suspicions were confirmed. After she reported Jason's disappearance to authorities, they were able to pull Pierce's records and found that he was a wanted fugitive from Syracuse, New York, where he had sexually abused a young female. He allegedly fled the state earlier. While Pierce lived in Florida, he used an alias known as Emerson Blatch, and Augusta knew him by that name. Pierce was located on May 22, 1980, 2 days after Jason's disappearance, and when authorities attempted to question him, he went for an officer's gun and was shot. He was questioned regarding Jason's current whereabouts, but he refused to divulge Jason's location, before dying later in the day from his injuries. Jason was never seen or located afterwards. Jason remains missing, and has never been located. His case remains open and unsolved. Foul play is suspected. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact Broward County Sheriff's Office 954-480-4300.
Number 5.
Martha was last seen in St. Augustine, Florida on November 27, 1985. She was last seen near her mobile home on Carrie Lynn Road, located off South Holmes Boulevard. She was apparently last seen walking west on her street during the night hours. The exact circumstances of her disappearance are unclear, and investigators are unsure of how exactly her disappearance took place. Her family members all gave different statements regarding the day she went missing. According to multiple accounts, Martha was out of school that day for Thanksgiving break, and she went to a neighbor's house with her mother, Margaret Ann Lambert. Martha stayed there until approximately 7:30 p.m., and told her mother, "Mom, I'm going over, I'll be back in 5 minutes." She left and proceeded to walk to her own mobile home, alone. When she got home, she split a baked potato with her older brother, David Allen Lambert, and had dinner. Martha then stated she was going out again, and when David asked where she was going, she replied, "It's none of your concern," and she left. She never returned back home, or to the neighbor's home, and was never seen or heard from again. Margaret said she became concerned when her daughter never returned, and went out to look for her, but was unable to locate her. She was reported as missing later that night, and deputies arrived at her residence at 3 a.m. to take the report. During the initial first 2 days of Martha being missing, a dozen officers from the sheriff's office searched the area without results. They questioned her family and neighbors about events from the night she disappeared. Her mother gave them the story about Martha being at the neighbor's house until 7:30 p.m. Her father, Howard Lambert, claimed that he last saw her when she left their home to return to the neighbor's house. Despite the stories, investigators couldn't exactly determine how she went missing. Martha was initially considered a runaway by police in 1985. Her home life was troubled, and her family life was dysfunctional at the time of her disappearance. Howard was an alcoholic with a violent temper. Neighbors recall hearing him yelling and fighting with Margaret in their mobile home. Due to child abuse, Martha and her 2 brothers, Raymond and David, spent much of their childhoods in foster homes. Her brothers also previously ran away from home. Some of those who knew Martha said she didn't like being at home that much and was known to be at her friends' residences quite often prior to her disappearance. One of Martha's neighbors, Alan Godby, lived 2 houses away from her at the time. He said she was friendly, but often appeared to be dirty and malnourished. However, Martha's family maintains she never would have left on her own accord, and Margaret stated she wouldn't even get into a friend's car without her permission. Once, investigators got a lead that Martha might have been in the Midwest as a runaway matching her description was found. However, the girl found ended up not being Martha, and investigators now think it's less likely she ran away from home. Investigators now believe other factors might have been involved in the case. Most authorities now believe that Martha is deceased and that she was the victim of a still unresolved homicide. Through the course of the investigation, investigators came up with several possible suspects in the case. Howard was looked at for possible involvement in his daughter's disappearance due to his abusive behavior. He was 74 years old in 1985. However, investigators said he would have been too frail to carry Martha's body into the woods and bury it. There was also insufficient evidence to say that he was the one involved. Investigators also considered the possibility that a neighborhood man, Clifford Morgan, might have been involved in Martha's disappearance. He was in his 60s at the time of her disappearance. Morgan knew the Lambert family, and Martha was known to visit his trailer home on a number of occasions. He had a reputation for liking and having children around his home, and was described as strange by some. Unfortunately, detectives may never know if Morgan was actually involved in the case, because he was murdered in a robbery not long after Martha vanished. He was beaten to death by two people, Gary Ward and Brenda Dunlop. They were charged with his murder, and were both sentenced to 22 years in prison with 5 additional years. They are currently out of prison. The original detective on the case doesn't believe Morgan was involved in Martha's case, but he hasn't been officially ruled out. Investigators also believe it's possible Martha was abducted by a non-family member after leaving her residence that evening. Neighbors reported seeing suspicious vehicles in the area while Martha was outside during that time. One vehicle was described as a van, and it appeared to be green in color. The 2 occupants of the vehicle were said to be male. The vehicle appeared to be near Martha and possibly following her. Nothing came of this lead, however. Nonetheless, investigators believe Martha was the victim of a homicide and was probably killed on the same day she went missing. Although a stranger abduction has been considered, it's believed that Martha was taken by someone she trusted. Various agencies continue to classify Martha as a non-family abduction. Investigators have received more than 50 tips regarding her disappearance, but none of them have panned out. In 2002, the sheriff's office received a tip that Martha was killed and her body might have been buried in an area near State Road 207, located very close to her residence at the time. Authorities used radar equipment to search the area, but were unable to locate anything. It's possible construction covered the grave, if she was indeed buried there. The lead ultimately proved fruitless. Investigators have always suspected that Martha's brother, David, knew more about his sister's disappearance than he let on. He was questioned on the night Martha disappeared, and gave different accounts about the last time he saw his little sister. He initially claimed he saw Martha getting into a black vehicle that drove away. The story didn't pan out. He then went on to claim he saw her walking down the street towards the Lilcham convenience store on 207. David was 14 years old at the time of his sister's disappearance. The detectives felt David was hiding or covering something. Margaret said her son might have known something, but didn't want to tell. She theorized that Martha was abducted, and that the persons who took her threatened David into silence. She also stated that on the night she found her daughter missing, she walked up to their trailer home and saw David come out laughing. She said he would never tell her why he was laughing, and that it always bothered her. In 2000, David was arrested for passing a bad check. He had an extensive criminal record, not for any violent crimes, but rather petty crimes. While being interviewed, he told investigators that he was responsible for Martha's death 15 years earlier. David told the police that he buried her body in a Coquina mine shaft located off Holmes Boulevard. Investigators searched the area, but didn't recover Martha's remains. Due to the lack of evidence, no charges were filed at that time. In June of 2009, investigators reopened the investigation into Martha's disappearance and classified her disappearance as an unresolved homicide. They interviewed those close to her at the time, and many of them said they should talk to David about his sister's disappearance. When interviewing him, they had a picture of Martha present, and it took 20 hours, but they got something out of him. The interview took place in August of 2009. David confessed in detail to causing Martha's death years earlier in a freak accident. He claimed that on the day of his sister's disappearance, their parents got into a fight because Margaret accidentally burned the Thanksgiving turkey, and this sent Howard into a rage. To avoid the commotion, David took Martha and left the house with her. They both went to the nearby Lilcham store, where Martha spent a little over $4 and kept the remaining change. They then went to the abandoned Florida Memorial College near their home. This was a common place where neighborhood children and other people went to hang out and play. It's been dubbed as the poor kids' Disney World. David said that he and his sister got into a fight over the change because Martha refused to give it up. She punched David across the face, and in return he pushed her. Martha fell backwards and got her head on a piece of metal protruding from the ground. This penetrated her skull, killing her. David said when he realized what happened, he picked his sister up and said she was bleeding from a large hole in the back of her head. He cried out for help, hoping someone would come help his sister. No one apparently heard him, and Martha had died from her injuries. David stated he was scared of what his parents would do to him if they found out what he had done to his sister. He also did not want to face legal trouble over her death, so he used a broken piece of a road sign to dig a 3-foot makeshift grave. David said he placed Martha's body in the hole and buried it before returning home. Investigators stated they believed David was telling the truth about his sister's death because he appeared emotional and full of grief when admitting. They used the confession and closed the missing persons investigation into Martha's disappearance. Investigators and forensics searched the Florida Memorial College for any trace of Martha's remains, but ultimately found nothing. In the mid-1990s, the area of the college campus was razed and completely rebuilt. It's possible the construction disturbed or scattered any remains that were left behind, that is if she was buried there to begin with. While cadaver dogs did show a change in behavior in the area that David claimed Martha's body was buried in, excavations showed nothing was buried there. After David's confession became a public matter, Margaret denied that he was the one involved. She stated that David always liked to be the center of attention, and that he likely used his sister's disappearance as a way of doing it. She believes that others were responsible for Martha's disappearance, and that she was probably kidnapped while walking outside that evening. Despite this, the detectives still believe the confession to be true. The case was presented to the Attorney General's office, who decided that if David were to face charges for his sister's death, manslaughter would be the most appropriate charge. However, due to statute of limitations that existed for manslaughter at the time of Martha's alleged murder, he will not face charges in her death. After his mother came into the spotlight, David himself denied that he killed his sister. He stated that he only told detectives what they wanted to hear because they wanted to close Martha's case. Margaret believes David was coerced into confessing. He claims that he had nothing to do with Martha's disappearance, and that he has no idea what happened to her or where she is currently located. Following his confession, Martha's disappearance was labeled as solved, and her case was closed. However, investigators have stated that they can reopen the case in the future if new witnesses were to come forward with more information about the case. At the time of her disappearance, Martha was a 7th grade student at Catterlinus Junior High School. Her grades in school were poor, and there was no tradition of books or learning in her family. Martha was said to be friendly, sweet, and shy at the time of her disappearance. She wanted to be liked, but had few friends at the time. Those who knew her described her as feisty beyond her size, and was a force to be reckoned with. She enjoyed soccer, fried potatoes, spaghetti, singing, and country music. In 1985, Martha's mother and father have both passed away in the decades since her disappearance. Howard passed away in 1995. He still lived on Carey Lynn Road prior to his death. He and Margaret had divorced after Martha's disappearance, and she remarried and moved to Daneville, Illinois, her hometown. Margaret passed away in 2020. Her two brothers are still alive and live in the area still. Her disappearance remains unsolved and foul play is suspected. Some agencies might classify her as a runaway. If you have any information concerning this case, please contact St. Johns County Sheriff's Office 904-824-8304.
Number 6.
Robert Keck was in a great mood when he left his Upper Saucon Township, Pennsylvania house around 1 p.m. on June 30, 1979. It was a pleasantly warm Saturday afternoon, and the 16-year-old had plans to spend some time with his girlfriend. She lived about 2 miles away in Coopersburg, Pennsylvania. Since Robert didn't have a driver's license yet, he would normally walk the 2 miles or get a ride from one of his friends. On this afternoon, Robert told his mother that he was meeting up with a friend who was going to give him a ride, and promised to be home later that evening. Karen Keck told her son to have fun, then watched as he walked out the front door of their Main Street home. She had no idea that she would never see him again. When Robert didn't return home that night, his parents were immediately concerned. He wasn't the type of teenager who tended to stay out late, and he always kept in constant contact with his parents. Karen called his girlfriend's house to see if he was still there. She was startled to learn that Robert hadn't been there at all that day. When Robert left the house that afternoon, he had told his mother that he was going to meet up with someone who was going to drive him to his girlfriend's house, but he had neglected to mention this person's name. Karen called all of her son's friends, but none of them had seen him that day, and no one knew who Robert might have been expecting to give him a ride. Karen immediately called the Upper Saucon Township Police Department and reported her son missing. Although police did issue a missing person bulletin to all police departments in Pennsylvania and several surrounding states, they believe that the teenager had likely run away from home and did little to actually locate him. Robert's family knew that he wouldn't have voluntarily disappeared. He was very close with his family and had no reason to want to leave home. He was known for being rather timid. One of his hobbies was trapping muskrats in nearby wooded areas, but he refused to check his traps alone in the winter months when it got dark early. He didn't like to be outside by himself once the sun went down. All of Robert's belongings were still inside his room, including a small amount of cash that he had saved. He had left home wearing only a t-shirt and a pair of cut-off shorts. He normally would have taken a sweatshirt or jacket with him if he planned on being out after dark. With no money and no extra clothing, it seemed clear that Robert had every intention of returning home after he visited with his girlfriend. Police interviewed many of the residents who lived on the route Robert would have taken to get from his house to the home of his girlfriend, and they were unable to find any witnesses who had seen Robert at all that day. His trail seemed to come to an abrupt end shortly after he walked out of his front door. A week after Robert disappeared, his family offered a reward for any information that led to his safe return. Although they tried to remain optimistic, they feared that he might have been a victim of foul play. Still, the fact that his body hadn't been found anywhere gave them hope that he would be found alive. There was little progress made on the case for the next year. In July 1980, the Upper Saucon Township Police Department asked for the Pennsylvania State Police to join the investigation. Officials admitted that they still had no conclusive evidence pointing to whether Robert had left voluntarily or run into foul play, and they were hoping that the added resources the state police could provide would help them finally determine what had happened. Upper Saucon Township Chief of Police William Edmonds continued to believe that Robert was a runaway. Given enough time, he assumed the teenager would return home on his own. The Pennsylvania State Police, however, weren't so sure. They found it odd that Robert had made no attempt at contacting his girlfriend or any of his friends, Most teenagers who ran away from home would normally stay in contact with their friends, even if they didn't want their parents to know where they were. Prior to his disappearance, Robert had given no indication that he had any problems in his life. He had just finished up his sophomore year at Southern Lehigh High School. He was a popular student and got decent grades. Although he had turned 16 a few months before he vanished, he hadn't felt the need to get his driver's license right away, as several of his friends were always willing to drive him around. His older sister had gotten engaged shortly before Robert went missing, and he had been looking forward to attending her wedding. His sister's fiancé was in the military. This meant that his sister would be moving to Virginia once she got married. Robert had noticed that his mother had been somewhat sad that her daughter was going to be so far away, and he had assured his mother that he would still be living at home with her. There was no way he would have simply disappeared. State police investigators interviewed about 60 people in their quest to learn what had happened to Robert, but they were unable to find anyone who had any pertinent information. Although there had been no large-scale physical searches conducted, detectives noted that area farmers had already plowed their fields twice since Robert disappeared, and there had been countless hunters wandering through the woods that autumn during hunting season. If Robert's body had been in the area, it likely would have been found. Although the dozens of interviews conducted had yielded little in the way of actual facts, detectives did notice that there were two rumors that came up numerous times. The first was that Robert had run away with the Moonies, members of the cult-like Unification Church who had passed through Pennsylvania around the time that he went missing. The second was that he had been picked up and likely killed by a motorcycle gang. Investigators attempted to determine the origin of these rumors, but were unable to find any evidence to indicate that either one was true. Robert's case soon went cold, though his parents continued to do everything they could to try and locate him. The Upper Saucon Township Police Department followed up on a few tips that were called in over the next few years, but by 1987, they admitted that they had exhausted all leads, and were still no closer to determining what had happened to Robert. Although they admitted that the amount of time that had passed made it unlikely that he had simply run away from home, they had no evidence to suggest that he had been abducted or murdered. Investigators were certain that there were people in the area who knew what had happened to Robert, and they made a public appeal for anyone with information to come forward. It had been over 8 years since Robert had disappeared, and they were hopeful that the passage of time might make people more amenable to speaking with detectives, but their request went unanswered. By 2014, Robert had been missing for 35 years. His mother, Karen, had come to terms with the fact that her son had likely been killed, but she continued to hope that his body would be found, so she and her husband could give him a proper burial. She was 78 years old in 2014, and told reporters that she wanted answers before she died. It was around this time that law enforcement received a tip that appeared to be legitimate. A woman who had lived in the Coopersburg area at the time Robert went missing claimed that she and a friend had been involved in his disappearance and knew where his body was buried. Although police did not release the identity of this person, they believed that her information was credible, and they decided to conduct a search of the area where she claimed his body would be found. The woman indicated that Robert had been buried in a wooded area in Berks County, Pennsylvania, about halfway between Reading and Allentown. Investigators approached the current owner of the 72-acre property, a retired Lehigh University professor, and he gave them permission to search the area in May 2014. The woman had indicated that Robert's body would be found near a small stone wall on the property. Investigators spent 4 days combing the area, but found nothing. Undeterred, investigators returned to the property the following month. During this second search, they knocked down the old stone wall and spent days combing through an area of the property where an old farmhouse had stood before it burned to the ground. Once again, they came away empty-handed. A third search of the property was conducted in May 2015, The fact that nothing was found made many doubt the credibility of the unidentified informant. To date, there have been no additional searches, and the fate of Robert remains unknown. Robert Keck was 16 years old when he went missing in 1979. He has hazel eyes and blonde hair, and at the time of his disappearance he was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 140 pounds. He was last seen wearing cut-off jeans and a blue t-shirt with the words Beach Bum Virgin Islands printed in tan, and tan shoes with crepe soles. He was also wearing a silver chain with a white cross on it. If you have any information about Robert, please contact the Upper Saucon Township Police Department at 610-282-3064.